Welcome to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Janet Jefferson. Today, we are discussing CASAs, or Court-Appointed Special Advocates for Children. And here with us are Executive Director Rebecca Tingle and Program Coordinator Tracy Lane, both from Anne Arundel County CASA. Thank you for being here today, both of you. To our viewers, please feel free to submit any questions or comments that you have in the comment section, and we can get to as many of those as we can. Let's jump right in. First, let's just talk a little bit about what is a CASA. So court-appointed special advocates. A little bit just about what they are, the role that they serve, and why they're so important. So Rebecca, how about you, you start with that?
So a CASA volunteer is an adult who has to be 21 years of age and have a desire to help children. They don't have to have a special degree or a background in social work or the legal field. Again, it's just a desire to help children in need. So they submit an application and we have an interview process, and then the volunteer goes through a 35-hour training program that's a combination of class time and home study. And Tracy actually coordinates and facilitates our whole training program of CASA volunteers. So once they've gone through the training, obviously we do a very thorough background check, and then they are sworn in and ready to take a case. And they're sworn in by the administrative judge of the circuit court, the Honorable Laura Ripkin, officiates our swearing in ceremony. So once they have gone through training, we then pair them up with a child. And I can let Tracy explain more about that, since that she has her hands on the pulse of that.
Yeah, that would be great, Tracy. If you could tell us just a little bit what that training process looks like, and then once you are trained, how you get matched.
Okay, so the training process, well, we train on child development, issues facing families like substance abuse, domestic violence. We talk about the court system, and attachment to parents, attachment to foster parents. So the role of the CASA, if I can back up a little bit, is to be an impartial person who provides information to the court so that the judge or magistrate can make really good decisions on behalf of children who are involved in the court system because they've been abused or neglected. So that the majority of these children are currently in foster care, and our role is to provide very objective, fact-based information on the child's situation and to provide recommendations for what's in the child's best interests. So our training sort of envelops everything that a volunteer would need to know in order to do that very effectively.
How is a CASA volunteer different or similar to someone like a social worker or a mentor? Because I imagine that a lot of these kids, I'm hoping a lot of these kids already have a bit of a team, whether it be the foster parent, a lawyer, or whoever that they're working with. How is a CASA sort of, what aspects are similar to those different roles, and then how maybe are they different? Rebecca, why don't you sort of take a stab at that?
The CASA volunteer is that one objective, independent third party who's in that child's life, not because they have to be there, but because they want to be there. So all of the children that we serve, unfortunately, they have been abused or neglected, and they are part of the foster care system. So they do have a social worker through the Department of Social Services. They also are appointed an attorney through legal aid. And that attorney is there to represent what the child wants. That's how Maryland law is set up. Just like any attorney, that attorney is there to represent what that child or person wants. They're not there to serve the best interests in terms of what the CASA volunteer does. So the CASA looks at the big picture, and they make recommendations on what they feel would be best for that child. Legal aid obviously takes into account what's best, but they're looking at it from a different perspective, a different platform, just like any attorney representing their client would. Mm-hmm. So if you have a 9-year-old child that tells their attorney that they want to go home, no matter how bad it is at home, and even though that attorney might not think that's the best thing for the child, that attorney will tell the judge, Your Honor, Jimmy would like to return home. And that's why the CASA is so important. And that's why so many of our legal aid attorneys want a CASA appointed. Our judges want a CASA appointed because they know that we don't leave anything out. We provide the most objective, unbiased information and present that to the court so that the judge can make the best decisions for that child, the decisions that will have a profound impact on their life. And I know you mentioned mentoring. We, as children in Maryland can stay in foster care until they're 21. And we have children that have, unfortunately, they have been in care until they're 21, and they may have been in care for 10 years or more because they can make a decision as to whether or not they want to be adopted. So when you have a CASA that's assigned to an older child, an adolescent who is then transitioning to adulthood, that role shifts a little bit towards a mentoring role, but mentoring is only a component of what we do, but we are not a mentoring program.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That makes sense. So the CASA's role is really looking out for the best interest of the child, sort of whether the child realizes it or not, because kids are kids and they're not developmentally ready to make some of these really big decisions for themselves. So you need an adult who can see their future in a really positive way and sort of send them in that right direction. That makes sense.
I'm sorry.
No, jump right in.
The other thing that I think is really critical to think about when you're talking about the role of a CASA is that the CASA's job is to talk to everybody involved in the child's life. So that includes the DSS caseworker, the foster parent, the biological parents, the teachers, the therapists, the doctors, everybody who lays eyes on that child in the course of their time in foster care. And so we do have a different kind of picture because the DSS caseworker has multiple cases. A CASA volunteer has one. And so it's one child or maybe a sibling group, but their focus can be solely on that child and that child's needs, whereas everybody else involved in the child's life have other things that they have to think about. DSS has to think about funding and budgets and caseloads and worker burnout. And so when they're making decisions, they're making them for the agency and not necessarily, they are looking out for the child, but they have other concerns as well. Right. And we as CASAs, we don't. We only look at what's best for the child, and we spend a lot of time with our kids. Our volunteers, we would like them to visit with their child weekly. The DSS caseworker can probably only see them once a month. Okay. And the child's attorney probably sees them 2 or 3 times a year. Okay. So the CASA has a lot more involvement.
So it almost sounds like the CASA acts as a hub of information, and that they're reaching out to all these different spokes that make up the child's team. And then they're able to synthesize that information and distill it down into a plan. And what they recommend is a plan moving forward for the judge to then hopefully direct the judge in his or her thinking.
I think that's the perfect way to explain it. I'm going to use that moving forward. Thank you.
That was beautiful.
Tracy, how do kids get matched up with CASAs or individual volunteers? I imagine that certain kids have certain needs and certain adults have certain strengths. So how do you pair them together?
So that's a great question, and you're absolutely right. We get an order from the court appointing us to a child's case, and then we go to our pool of volunteers. We obtain the court record and read up on the child's situation and what their needs are, and then we may match based on, if we have a child with significant educational issues and we have a retired teacher, that might be a really good match. I've had some kids who had significant medical issues, and I had a CASA volunteer who is a pediatrician, and I thought, well, that's a great match. It could be something that they are both interested in. Let's say they both are interested in art or science. We might match on those. And then we also might match based on where they're physically placed. If they're, some of our CASAs are in North County, and some are in South County. And so if we have a child placed way down in South County and we have a volunteer down that way, that might be a really good match, because it's going to mean they can spend a lot of time with that child. So there's a variety of things, and we try to take everything into consideration and make the best possible match. It could just be personalities.
That sort of highlights the point that you really would want a diverse volunteer base. And the more diversity that you have, then the better you can sort of find the right match for the kids. So on that sort of line of thinking, what are you looking for in a volunteer? And for people who are interested, how do they get started? So what's the process look like? Rebecca, why don't you?
I'll jump in, and then Trace, you can jump in after. So the first step is actually submitting an application through our website, which our website is aacasa.org. You just hit apply, fill out the application. And as soon as that is submitted, one of our staff members, reaches out. This is in normal times. We're still figuring out training during COVID, which will probably be Zoom in September. But the typical normal times, the application would be submitted. Nikki would reach out. Nikki Yappy, who is our volunteer coordinator, would reach out to the volunteer to schedule an interview and the reference checks. And then the interview is set up. And Tracy, why don't you jump in a little bit more in terms of the interview?
So there's an interview, go through the training. There's a sort of an exit phone screen. And, if we had any concerns about a potential volunteer, we would address that directly with the volunteer. We find that people who are not meant for this role usually figure it out in training, and we want that. We don't want people going into something that they can't make the time commitment for. So what we're looking for in volunteers is, first and foremost, people who can make the commitment. It's sort of an unusual volunteer role in that it's not an hour a week. It's the folks who are supposed to be experts say that CASA volunteers spend on average 15 or so hours a month on their case. Some months might be more than that. Some months might be less. Then we are also always looking for people of color. Children of color are overrepresented in the foster care system. And we are always looking for men, because the foster care system is loaded with women. There are lots and lots of women. There are lots of women foster parents and women caseworkers and women therapists, and our teenage boys need men. And so they need really strong, positive men in their lives. So we're always looking for men, but we're always looking for people, just people who have a passion.
How has COVID impacted you guys? So both in terms of your kids, but also in terms of your volunteers. Rebecca, why don't you start with that?
I'll start with the bigger picture, and I'll have Tracy talk more about the volunteers and kids in terms of the program effects. But from a big picture standpoint, obviously, like many nonprofits, we've all been affected financially. We had a golf tournament that was scheduled in May that we postponed to July, and then we ended up having to cancel that. And our gala that is normally in November, we are moving that to a virtual at-home gala, which is something completely new to us. So we're all in these uncharted, waters, not really knowing how things are going to work out, but we're optimistic and positive, because we know that what we're doing on behalf of the most vulnerable children in our community is so important. And especially during COVID, when children, they have been at home and we don't have eyes on them in terms of, children who aren't even part of the system. The teachers, the mandated reporters who normally, report cases of abuse and neglect. That's the scary thing right now. And Tracy can talk about the specifics of how our program has been impacted, in terms of our children and the volunteers. So
Rebecca is correct. The reports of abuse and neglect are down significantly. The last number I heard is something like 80%. So Whoa. They're just not, doctors teachers, all those mandated reporters they're not laying eyes on children. As far as our children go, our volunteers are, first of all, let me back up. Safety is paramount.
Mhm.
So we have, when everything sort of shut down, we instructed our volunteers not to visit their children in person. They have moved to virtual visits, Facebook, Zoom, whatever. And then they're also, maintaining phone contact with the important people in the child's life, just to make sure that they have everything they need and that they're healthy. We've asked our volunteers to specifically ask, is everyone in the household well? Is there anything that you need? So that's part of it. We also have a lot of volunteers who would fall into the high risk group. So we have to make sure that they are safe and that they are, looking out for themselves. Luckily in Anne Arundel County, I have not heard of any real horror stories. I have heard some horror stories from other counties in Maryland. We have had some instances where teenagers decided they were sick and tired of quarantine and they were leaving, and then they were not able to return. Because wherever either the foster parent or the group home said you can't come back because you've been out there. That has not occurred to a large extent in Anne Arundel County, but it hasn't in other counties. And I haven't heard of any of the children in our county being sick with COVID, but I have heard of children in other counties. So we've been very lucky here. And, our numbers have been pretty good, better than some other counties. And so I think that plays into it. And I think we have a fantastic foster parent association in Anne Arundel County. And I think that group of people have provided a lot of support and guidance to all the foster parents in the county. And so I think they've done a really good job of keeping people safe.
Mm-hmm. What are you guys doing to get ready for a new school season, with things being so sort of unknown and unsure and changing daily?
Well, so we are mainly reaching out at this point. I've just been talking to volunteers about ensuring that foster families and some of our kids are placed with relatives. I have one child right now who's placed with a grandmother. We want to make sure they have all the technology they need.
Mm-hmm.
We were doing that at the end of the school year. We're going to continue to do that. And as far as our program itself and things starting to reopen, our courthouse reopens to the public on Monday.
Okay.
That's another thing that has occurred, that since March, all of the hearings, or virtually all the hearings, got postponed. So those all have to be rescheduled, and that is going to be quite something to see. And it's not entirely clear with our courthouse what our hearings are going to look like moving forward. So we're just trying to keep the lines of communication open with all the stakeholders and with our volunteers so they know what to expect. Finally, we had just started a training class of volunteers in March. We had one class out of 5 when everything shut down. So in September, we're going to reactivate our training. I have a whole new curriculum that is a guided learning. It's meant to be more of an independent study, but it's also going to be done over Zoom. And I am learning as I go how to do all that. So it's been interesting for all of us.
Well, the good news is you're in good company. And I think the whole world right now is on a very steep learning curve.
Yes.
I wondered, Rebecca, how, first off, do all kids in the system get a CASA? And if not, then how is it decided who gets a CASA and who doesn't?
So right now, we are not serving every child in care. Our goal is to provide a CASA for every child. The courts want that.
Mhm.
Tracy has done a tremendous amount of work working with the courts and our judges to have children appointed at the adjudication hearing. I don't mean to get into all the legal term, but that's the first point where a CASA can be assigned and be appointed. And Tracy is there when things were normal, in the courtroom for cases that we were not assigned to, and just reminding everyone, does this child need a CASA?
Right.
And that, by her being there, her presence, we've increased the number of children who have received a CASA. Also, we've been fortunate to receive some grant funding that has permitted us to increase our staffing. So we have a ratio that we have to follow per national CASA that says for every full-time case supervisor who's working 40 hours a week, the maximum number of volunteers that they can supervise is 30. So when we are able to increase capacity, what that means is we add case supervisory hours. By adding hours, that opens up slots for CASAs to be appointed to children who are in care. So we have been at a place, and very fortunate that we have staff that have increased their hours because of funding that we've received. And we have volunteers who are seasoned volunteers who have had cases in the past and are ready to take another case. So we're positioned to be able to serve all of the children. We are serving about 85% of the children in care. So we are well on our way. And when things, open up, we will get back to doing the work that we do in terms of bringing new kids and eventually reaching that goal.
So that's the other impact of COVID is that for kids who have come into care during the shutdown, the court was hearing emergency cases only. And so the hearings at which we would be appointed have not occurred.
Okay.
So we fully anticipate two things. Once things really reopen, as far as the court system, we expect an influx of new children. And once schools and doctors' offices and what have you reopen, we expect new cases of abuse and neglect, because let's face it, some of these families have been stuck home with children with no school. These are already stressed families, and then you add COVID to the mix and quarantine, and it's a little scary to think about what might be happening behind closed doors while everything's closed.
Yeah, definitely. I see the future for you very busy, unfortunately. How at this point, so if you're only serving 85% of kids, how is that decision then made? Who needs or who's going to get a CASA and who's not? Rebecca, why don't you take that question?
Well, historically, when we were not able to serve every child, the judges knew that. So they were only assigning us the most complicated cases, which tended to be teenagers who didn't have a strong support system in their life. But within the last, what, Tracy, would you say, how long have you've been actively really pushing, like 2 years?
Yeah.
Where we've been really moving to change that thought pattern, because since 1997, we couldn't serve when we opened our doors. The judges knew we couldn't serve everyone. So changing that thought and knowing that, wait, CASA's here, they can serve every child. And by Tracy being in the courtroom and knowing the cases that we're not assigned to, so that she can be there and we can get appointed, that has been amazing.
So Tracy, is that sort of the limiting factor? You just need representation in the courtroom to make sure that your resource is sort of remembered and used?
Yeah, I'm finding that has been the most effective thing. There was a mindset for so long that we couldn't serve every child.
Okay.
Now that has changed, they also, I will say that the judges and magistrates, usually when they appoint us, it happens at the end of the hearing, and there's a lot going on, and they just kind of get sidetracked, and it doesn't occur to them. But I've been around long enough at this point that when they see my face sitting in the back of the courtroom, they know why I'm there. So that's been very helpful. So yeah, we absolutely can provide a CASA to every child in the system in Anne Arundel County. We just need the court to order it. Gotcha. And it's happening. Well, it was, and then COVID came, but we'll get back there again. There is an adjudication hearing, as Rebecca mentioned. That's the first hearing that we can be appointed in. There's one on Wednesday next week, and I intend to be there. So I don't know if they'll let me in the courtroom, but I'm going to be there. So we're going to get that ball rolling again.
Sounds like a plan. It sounds like CASAs have a lot to manage, and a lot of things that they're thinking about, and a lot of challenges. What do you, as an organization, provide to your volunteers as a sort of support system or a network to help them stay as sharp and as happy and healthy as you want your volunteers to be? Rebecca, why don't you start with that?
The most important thing is that our volunteers, we don't just give them a case and say, okay, go figure this out. They are assigned to one of our case supervisors who they have degrees in social work, psychology, etc. They are the lead person for that CASA. So whenever the CASA, is working through their case, it's that case supervisor that is guiding them throughout the whole process. I mean, my staff, they are available 24/7 in terms of working and assisting the volunteers throughout the case in terms of, email, phone calls, face-to-face meetings. Additionally, we provide in-service hours where we're training the volunteers outside of the training they receive to become a CASA. They're also receiving a plethora of training on various topics related to child welfare, substance abuse, diversity, etc., to prepare them and help to continue to keep them educated in the field.
So it sounds like you have a lot of resources that you are providing your volunteers, so they don't feel burnt out. Tracy, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that pretty much covered it. I mean, we provide guidance in the case. We also provide emotional support. These cases can be emotional. They can be really heartbreaking. And so we try to be that safe place that the volunteer can go to and vent, and we sort of process and talk things through. So that's a big part of my job and my colleagues' jobs in working with volunteers.
Absolutely. So let's say someone is in love with your organization and really wants to help, but for whatever reason, they aren't quite ready to take on the role of CASA. What are some other things that people can do to support your work?
So we have another group that is called Rex's Support Squad. And that group, it was created in honor of my late husband, Rex Tingle. So bear with me, excuse me if I get choked up. But Rex was a huge champion for our organization. And one of our very dear CASAs, Pat Howe, in working with my staff, surprised me after he passed with Rex's Support Squad. And you can look on our website to see the various ways that folks can get involved. But it's everything you could think of without being a CASA. If a child, for example, we had a child who wanted to go into photography, to learn about photography. Through Rex's Support Squad, a camera was purchased for this young child, and virtual photography classes were also provided. And it's things like that where Rex's Support Squad can come in and assist. Once we get back to normal, or our new normal, I should say, we have our various fundraising events. We always look for volunteers that might want to help out with our golf tournament or our gala. So there's a lot of, behind the scenes things that folks can do to become involved. And if anyone is interested, please feel free to reach out, to me, Rebecca, through, the website or via email. And hopefully, at the end, all of our contact information, we list that.
Yep, absolutely. All of this will be posted. So viewers definitely reach out to Rebecca and Tracy and through the website. And it's a great space to get involved. Well, I want to say a huge thank you to both of you for being here today to talk a little bit about CASA. So what the organization's all about, the great work that you do, and how important it is. Thank you to all of our viewers and listeners as well. Make sure to visit ChesapeakeFamily.com for up-to-date local information on health, family, and living for today's Maryland parent. This episode will be archived on ChesapeakeFamily.com in video and podcast format. I'm Janet Jefferson with Chesapeake Family Life and Third Floor Views. Thanks so much.
Thank you.